I had a teacher who, when I was 22, he was my age, so he seemed a little bit old. And Brother West would open class and he would say, "Good morning, scholars." And we'd look around and say, "Who's he talking to?" It's not any of us. And especially during a Bible class, a lot of times I would just want to say, "Good morning, Bereans." And unless you know the passage, those of Berea are more noble than those of Thessalonica because they studied the scriptures daily to see if these things were true. So this morning, may I say, good morning, Bereans, and delightful to have you in class. Especially if you're visiting, as Bill mentioned, there's outlines, and it will be really helpful to have one of those today just because of what we're going to do. We will be in Acts 22 in a little bit, but it'll take us a while to get there. And sometimes when I think of a class, sometimes I think of a microscope. You take a verse or a word and you spend a lot of time just focusing on that. Today's going to be more like a telescope. I want to stop and go back and look at some things that we have touched on. Some will be a review for some of us, but one of the wonderful things about continuing to study God's Word, Hebrew writer says it's living and active. And I oftentimes think about that just when I open my Bible. This is not just letters on a page. This is something that is the thoughts of God in print. This is living and active. And as we go back and look at that, which is living and active, maybe as we get older, sometimes it's able to speak to us in ways that it couldn't when we were younger. I often think of this. My great-grandmother was 75 when I was born. Until she was 93, she just had this, she had most of the New Testament memorized, literally. And I've told you I would just sit down with her after lunch on Sunday. She'd quote the entire book of James. She'd quote the entire book of Philippians. She'd quote the Sermon on the Mount. And then for commercial break, we would say the books of the Bible, and she would say them backwards from Malachi to Genesis or from Revelation. And she'd always say, "Now, son, reading your Bible is like playing basketball. You need to use both hands and go both ways. And when the preacher gives a verse, you should be there in your mind before he gets there." And I oftentimes thought, at 85, the Bible said things to her that it couldn't say to her when she was 15, because it is living and active. And just one of the things that has just kind of come to mind as we have gone through this is just the parallel between the inscription on the cross of Jesus, written by Pilate, which we'll look at in a second, and the cultural background of the Apostle Paul. And through all the years, I had never noticed that, so we'll start and kind of walk through some things that will lead us to that. But our central idea today is that from Acts 22 to the end of the book of Acts, Paul's life, his ministry, his career is going to totally change. And the terms that we're going to use is there's a transition from being a free man on the missionary journeys, evangelizing and planting churches, and the latter quarter of the book of Acts, Paul is a prisoner. And that's something just very significant. As you notice, he's still going to be the Apostle Paul. He's still going to be the apostle to the Gentiles, and as a prisoner, God is going to be able to do things with him and through him that he couldn't do as a free man. And I just want you to think about that in our own personal lives, because one of my favorite expressions about God is that I learn more about God in the rearview mirror than I do through the windshield. And sometimes things happen and you wonder, why did this happen? Or why did this take place? Or why didn't this happen? And then a few years later, you look back at that and you think, oh, I'm so grateful that what I hoped would happen didn't take place. And God is always working in people's lives. And here's going to be a wonderful case study, which will carry us actually through the end of the book of Acts, is that God is going to now call the Apostle Paul to become a prisoner. But God is going to open doors for him to teach and preach as a prisoner that he never could have done as a free man. So our aim today is that I want us to notice how Paul, as he's going to give his defense in a little bit, is going to then explain, and in the process, this is one of the most self-revealing sections about the Apostle Paul in the whole book of Acts. We're going to learn more about kind of his background, who he is, some things that are just a part of God's calling him. And as he makes this defense, we're going to learn a lot of things about why God chose him as the apostle to the Gentiles. I just use this expression. When Pilate is finally forced to hand Jesus over, when Luke writes to Theophilus, he gives 3 charges against Jesus, and he gives 3 attempts that Pilate makes to set him free. But it's going to be in the Gospel of John that I think that to embarrass the Jews, to kind of rub their nose in it, then he writes an inscription over the cross. And the thing that's significant, this is virtually blasphemy. Do you remember when the Jews say, "We have no king but Caesar"? On Wednesday night, we've been talking about Israel was to be a theocracy and God was to be the king. And they were so desperate to get Jesus crucified that they virtually are willing to blaspheme their whole position as the leaders of Israel and say, "Oh, we have no king but Caesar." And so Pilate is then going to write, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And this whole discussion revolves around Pilate saying, "Oh, behold your king." And then here's the inscription, and you'll notice this in John 19 and 20. Many of the Jews read this inscription, and I'm basically going to say anybody who could read can read. And what I mean is this. The place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Aramaic, which is going to be your local language of the Hebrews. It is written in Latin if you are Roman or if you read Latin, and it's going to be written in Greek. And since the early 300s, Greek has become the primary trade language, the language of travel. Many people knew Greek. And what's significant is that if you could read it all, okay, if you could read either in Aramaic or in Latin or in Greek, Pilate, and this is what I always think of, kind of to rub their nose in it, since he's forced to do this, says, "Oh, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," and he writes that inscriptions in all of the current languages. Something that I think about, and don't just ponder a lot, but I still think about, isn't it amazing that Jesus and his apostles speak Aramaic, but when the New Testament is written, it's written in Greek? Even the very writing of the New Testament begins this translation of God's word into different languages. And you read in Acts chapter 2, "Oh, there were assembled in Jerusalem Jews from all these nations under heaven." And here comes this whole list of places that Jews are from, and the gospel being spread to all places and all languages. Even the writing of the New Testament is written in a language other than what the people were speaking themselves. And here's God working to both communicate and to transmit that language. One of the terms that we've looked at earlier, but I want to just review this real quick. We're back in Acts 9, and what I want us to notice today is that Dr. Luke chooses to give 3 accounts of Paul's conversion. The first one is in chapter 9, which we're going to read from in a second, and this is how it happened, this is what took place. Today, when we come to Acts 22, he is going to give an account of his conversion as a part of his defense. And then this will also be a part of his defense in chapter 26. And so 3 different times, Luke gives us different kind of perspectives, different comments about the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. I'm sorry, I laugh. I put myself in the place of Ananias, and everybody in Damascus is scared to death because they know Saul is coming. And God says, "I want you to go and talk with this man." And if you're Ananias, just kind of emotionally and verbally, you're going to say, but Lord, I mean, haven't you heard? Of course God has. And it would just be a matter of just absolute shock that God would say to Ananias, I want you to go speak to this man. And notice this term, the Lord said to Ananias, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine. And that's one of my favorite descriptions of Paul, in that God is going to choose him. And as we're going to notice today, I think one of the contributing reasons of that is, yes, his heart, his intellect, just the strength of character, but it's also going to be his cultural background. Because in the same way that the words of the crucifixion are given in a multilingual inscription, then this is also going to be descriptive of Paul's personal life. And he will carry my name, and here are three things that we're going to notice that will carry us through our lesson today. So he's a chosen instrument of mine, Acts 9:15, and he will carry my name, and here's the three things, before Gentiles. Secondly, before kings, and the third is the children of Israel. And so when he is still Saul of Tarsus, before he becomes Paul, then God's very specific to say, here's my chosen instrument, and anticipate, as my instrument, he is going to take my word, he's going to preach the gospel, and it's going to include those three different categories, Gentiles. Secondly, kings. And third is going to be the children of Israel. And so from his arrest in Acts 20 through the end of Acts, then Luke gives us a commentary on chapter 9 and verse 15. And the transition that we're going to take place today is that as Paul has finished his third missionary journey, and he's made all of these travels as a free man, and as he chooses to go to Jerusalem, even though people had encouraged him not to do that, then once he becomes arrested, then the rest of the book of Acts, the transition is, he will now be working, functioning, ministering as a prisoner. But as a prisoner, he's going to take the gospel to the Gentiles, he's going to take the gospel to kings, and he's going to take the gospel to the children of Israel, even as the call was made from the earlier part when Ananias came to speak with him. So here are the three cultures, and we'll do this quickly. But the first thing we're going to notice is that he's a Jew, and we find from Philippians, he's from the tribe of Benjamin. And in the book of Hebrews, he said, in the book of Philippians, he says, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. And I don't know what our family to Brazil did. The Nortons told us that while they were living in Brazil, the custom was we speak Portuguese all day long until we come home from dinner till the end of the day. Did you guys do something like that as well? And I'm sorry, that's so important so your kids can talk to their grandparents. I mean, what's going to happen if your kids come back on furlough and they can't talk to anybody because nobody here speaks Portuguese? And so a lot of our missionary families will have something like this. And the Norton said everybody was quite happy all through the day from the time they woke up, all the meals and everything, and they spoke Portuguese. But the rule was now from supper or dinner, whatever you want to call it, till the end of the day, we're going to speak English. F.F. Bruce thinks that they spoke Hebrew in Paul's home. I am a Hebrew of Hebrews. Yes, I'm born, but so many of the Jews had Hellenized. They had spoke Greek primarily. And so Saul's going to say, just from my interbeing, and then he'll use that term, I'm a Pharisee, and according to the law, I'm blameless. And so here is a person who he just specifically says on different occasions, I am a Jew, and this is going to be such a significant part of his background and who he is. We'll talk a little more about that in a second. Secondly, he's born in Tarsus, and as you go up the Mediterranean and you come to the edge of Asia Minor, then Cilicia is that first province right in the bottom corner. And other than Athens and Alexandria, Tarsus was one of the leading university cities in Asia Minor and in the Eastern Roman Empire. Help me just a second. It would be like growing up in Austin or College Station or Norman or Stillwater, meaning I grew up in a university town. And so here's a Jew, and we're going to notice he's very fluent in Greek, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But he grows up in a university town in the earliest years. But then here's the one that's so interesting. We're going to find out today he was born a Roman citizen. And we'll come back and talk about that in a second. But that's what I've just loved about going through this time. For all the years that I've studied Acts, it has never occurred to me that the cultures, the background of the Apostle Paul is identical to the languages that were nailed to the cross over the head of Jesus. So just notice a couple of these. First, I am a Jew. We're going to find in chapter 21, verse 40, when he makes a short defense to the people who have been trying to kill him, he speaks to them either in the Hebrew dialect, some translations will say Aramaic. And so, yes, here's his Jewish background. And remember, I want you to be my chosen instrument to the children of Israel. And so when it's appropriate, then Paul can address an audience either in Hebrew or Aramaic, which is kind of their native tongue as such. And he will also mention later, circumcised on the 8th day, as we mentioned, of the tribe of Benjamin, and all of these other things. The second thing, though, is that when Paul is being rescued, and this is going to be something that's going to also take place in chapter 21, he says to the commander who came to him, "May I say something to you?" So now here's our Hebrew of Hebrews, who is addressing a Roman officer, and he speaks to him in Greek. Because the officer, how do we know this? The officer says, "Oh, do you speak Greek?" You wouldn't ask that unless Paul spoke to him in Greek in that context. And so here's our Hebrew of Hebrews, born in a Jewish household, and as we're going to see, also educated by Gamaliel in Jerusalem. And when it's appropriate, he can speak in Greek to the people that he needs to. But this is the thing I always think about. He dictates most of his letters in Greek. You can't dictate something as complicated as Paul's letters unless you're fluent in being able to speak that language very well. And when you come to the end of the book of Romans, then you'll find that reference where the writer just says, I wrote this letter. And so Paul is so fluent that he's actually going to be able to speak and to write in Greek. But the one that we said, I was born a Roman citizen, and the commander is going to say in chapter 22, 27, and 28, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And here's what's significant. If you pretend to be a Roman citizen and you can't prove that, you can be killed for making that claim. And everybody's aware of that. And I don't know if he had a document with him. I don't know how he was able to do that. But you will notice after he and Silas are beaten in Philippi, and after they spend the night in prison, in the future, when it's appropriate, Paul is going to say, "I'm a Roman citizen." And here's what's so unusual about that. Very few Jews would have been Roman citizens. One of the major cultural phenomena in the first century is that if you're a Greek, but you enlist in the Roman military, and I can't remember if it's either 20 or 25 years, but if Greg enlists in the military as a Greek, and I say this, if he survives, because there's a lot of danger in doing that, but if you survive and you are discharged, then you are discharged as a Roman citizen. And so Greeks would have 3 names, as many of us were given, and they would change one of his name, maybe either to one of his officers, commanders, or something else. But here's the benefit. All children and family from then on are now Roman citizens. There's a whole group of tax breaks that they get. There's taxes they don't have to pay. There are military benefits. There are also opportunities that they couldn't be beaten. They couldn't be, there were certain penalties that they wouldn't endure as a Roman citizen. And so, when the commander comes to Paul and he says, "Are you a Roman citizen?" Paul says, "Yes, I am." And in this case, the commander says, "Oh, I purchased my citizenship with a great price." And we're not told what that was. And again, is it something that he did both in terms of service? Was it something he did financially? And then Paul just quietly says, "I was born a citizen." Can I do this? I'm not a discharged, I'm not a new citizen. I was born a citizen. Now, what is so unusual about that is that most Jews are not going to enlist in the military because they had a standard, and these standards were considered by the Jews virtually to be idolatry. And there were all kinds of things that took place. So just very, very few Jews were ever in the military and would take the path of enlisting in order to become that. However, if you did something notable to contribute to a leading Roman or something, occasionally citizenship could be conferred. And we're not told what it is, but here's an educated guess. Either Paul's father or grandfather had done something notable to help a leading Roman, and that Roman conferred citizenship on Paul's father or grandfather. And so here's what's so amazing. Here's a man, Hebrew of Hebrews, tribe of Benjamin, who's raised initially in a very educated Greek city, who's very articulate and vocal in his Greek, but he's also born a Roman citizen. So if you look at the next page, I just want to mention something about the geography that Luke mentions. And when you look at Luke, if you start at the bottom, Luke is a circle geographically. Things start in Jerusalem, they're in the temple. You have all of these people who come and see Jesus when he's small. And then you're going to go up and do the Galilean ministry. That will take you up through Luke chapter 9. And then in 9:51, Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem. And only Luke, from chapter 9 to chapter 18, tells us about the trip down to Jerusalem. And then Jesus comes to Jerusalem in the ministry there. He's crucified. And then the ascension takes place in Jerusalem. So when I read Luke, I think literally of a circle. That you start in Jerusalem, you go to Galilee, you do the ministries, then you take the journey back down, you come back, and Luke geographically is just this circle. And if it wasn't for the Gospel of John, we wouldn't know that there were 3 Passovers in 3 years. So this is the geography of Luke. In the book of Acts, it's going to be different in that in 1:8, I want you to be my witnesses in Jerusalem and Judea. So the gospel is going to be taken there primarily through Peter. And then we're going to go to Samaria, and this will include Philip, and we'll go through chapter 8. And then as we head towards the ends of the earth, then this will be done primarily by Paul. But in Acts, the gospel starts in the center of Judaism, in Jerusalem, and anticipate it's going to end in the center of the Roman Empire in the city of Rome. And the city of Rome was the most significant city in all of the empire. I had a Roman history teacher say, you know, if you combined Tokyo and Los Angeles and New York and London and Paris, you still probably wouldn't have the impact that Rome had in the first century. It was kind of the city in the ancient world. And here's some of these other things that's so amazing about the Apostle Paul. And we mentioned this the last couple of weeks. He writes the book of Romans, and he keeps saying, I'm wanting to come to you. I've been delayed, but I'm coming to you in Rome. And then he comes to chapter 16, and he lists 30 people by name who are members of the church in Rome, and he hasn't been there yet. Isn't that amazing? Here's all these people that he's met in his missionary journeys, and send greetings to, and it includes Aquila and Priscilla and Rufus, and yes, she was my mother in the gospel, and this is why Rome is so significant. And so in the book of Acts, as the gospel spread, we're going to go from the center of Judaism to the center of the Roman Empire. I want you to notice Paul is described as the apostle who is untimely born. And this is 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 8. And what he's going to say by that, and we're actually going to close with this today, is that the original apostles, when they replaced Judas, had to have been with Jesus somewhere in his ministry, but be a witness to his resurrection. The primary part that Paul is going to be qualified as an apostle is that Jesus is going to come and speak with him. But he will use this expression, I'm an apostle who was untimely born. I was totally different in terms of my background and the things that were part of my becoming an apostle. And when you look at his conversion, and this is 1:1 on the back of that second page, when he is this chosen instrument, then he's going to go, as we said, Gentiles, kings, and Israel. And then he's also going to be told this in Acts 26, I'm going to deliver you from your people. And this is what's going to take place when he's arrested, because they try to kill him 2 or 3 times. So Paul, I'm going to deliver you from your people and from the Gentiles to whom I am sending you. And here's a guy who's been blind for 3 days, and this always just strikes a chord with me. God is going to take something physical in his life to make a very significant spiritual application. And if you're a person of sight and you've been blind for 3 days, you've had a lot of time to kind of think and to have introspection. And so now that you can see, then he is told, I'm going to send you to the Gentiles to open their eyes. And so for someone who's been blind for 3 days physically, spiritually, I want you to learn from that and to draw off of that. And a part of your ministry is, I want you to open their eyes that they may turn from darkness to light. And you stop and think, physically, that's just what's happened to him. By now being able to see, he has gone literally from physical darkness to being able to see again. And spiritually, as you go to the Gentiles, I want you to open their eyes, turn them from darkness to the light, and then from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified. So here's what we've noticed. From chapter 13 to chapter 20, Paul functions as an apostle. He fulfills his calling as a free man. And as we said, now through the end, then he will do so as a prisoner. And so his custom is, in taking the gospel to the Israelites, he will always go to the synagogue, and on 3 occasions, you'll find this in Antioch, in Corinth, and in Ephesus. He will leave the synagogue, and then will go to the Gentiles. He will have contact with Roman officials. We've noticed Sergius Paulus in chapter 13, who's the proconsul of Cyprus. He has contact with Galileo. And then, now that he's arrested, his defense to the children of Israel, well, let me say it this way, his ministry to the children of Israel will be primarily done through his defenses that are there. And we'll find that he will make a speech on the steps after they've tried to kill him, and will anticipate he made a speech to the Sanhedrin, and he also then will speak to the Jews at the very, very end. And this is a part of his call, take the message to the Israelites. One last comment here, and then I want us to turn the page. It's interesting to me that in Acts 21, after they have attacked Paul and they start beating him in the temple precincts, when they lead him out of the temple to kill him outside before the Romans get there, they close the doors of the temple. Leon Morris was talking about the betrayal of Jesus by Judas, and he said, isn't it interesting, the Gospel of John, John just quietly says, as Judas leaves, Judas went out and it was night. And Leon Morris quietly said, it was dark outside and it was dark in his soul. And sometimes Scripture uses a physical description to describe something spiritually, and how significant the same Jews who have hollered away with him and crucify him are going to holler, away with him, and are trying to kill Paul. And they don't want to kill him in the temple. So they take him outside of the temple and they shut the doors of the temple. And how symbolic that what they are doing spiritually, let's say it the other way, what they're doing physically, they're also doing spiritually. They're shutting themselves off from the plan and the teaching of God and not really understanding the significance of what they're doing. So if you look at the next page, he will carry my name before the Gentiles, and you'll notice this in a whole range of things, especially at the end. He will be in Rome for 2 years. And because he is in Rome as a prisoner, we've noticed this, the imperial guard, the praetorium will hear the gospel, Caesar's household. And then he will carry my name before kings, and we'll have most excellent Felix, Festus, King Agrippa, and then Paul, as his Roman citizen, then will appeal to Caesar. We're going to read quickly through chapter 22 and just notice some of the highlights that Luke tells us at this account. Brothers, hear the defense that I make with you. When they heard that he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became very still. I am a Jew born in Tarsus, but brought up in Jerusalem, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers. I persecuted this way to death. And he describes things that he did in persecuting Christians, and he was on his way to Damascus. As I drew near, in verse 6, a great light from heaven shone around me. I fell to the ground, and I heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? He asks who he is, and Jesus says, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting me. Those who were with me saw the light. They didn't understand the voice. I said, what shall I do? And the Lord said, rise, go into Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. And this is one of these little bitty things, but I always notice this. If you're blind, how do you get to Damascus? You have to be dependent upon someone to help you. And how often in Paul's ministry is it his helpers, whether it's Timothy, Titus, Epaphras, there's a whole host of people who are constantly helping him, but physically, getting from the road to Damascus, even into the city, he is going to have to depend on other people to help him to get there. And I was led by the hand by those who were with me. And then here comes Ananias, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very hour, I received my sight, and he said, the Lord of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, to hear the voice, and you will be a witness for him to every one of what you have seen and heard. Lord, want to touch on this next week. Arise, be baptized, wash away your sins. And then the details of what takes place as he goes to Jerusalem, and he's told that he will go to the Gentiles, and you'll see the rest of the things that take place. So, most excellent Theophilus is going to learn these things about Saul. First of all, he was a Jew born in Tarsus. Secondly, he speaks Greek. And thirdly, that he was born a Roman citizen. Saul was the one who, in the early description of the church, is described as the way. Saul is the one who persecuted the way, and you'll see terms like, I was a violent man. And yes, consenting to the stoning of Stephen was part of this, but as you read through these, there's several accounts where Paul is active in killing Christians. Yes, putting them in prison, but many Christians were killed because of him, and this was a part of his nature. But what was interesting about Jesus is that when he is in his home synagogue and he opens Scripture and he reads from Isaiah 61 and says, today this is fulfilled in your hearing, then all is well, as he's talking about the Old Testament, and then he starts talking about two different Gentiles that are brought into God's care, Naaman the Syrian and the widow of Sidon. And what do the Jews want to do? They take him out to throw him off of a cliff to kill him. And the irony is that the Jews were always intended by God to be a light to the Gentiles, but they took that privilege to primarily be just about them and exclusively about them. And God had an inclusive view of their position, and they took an exclusive view. It's just us that God is concerned in. And as soon as Jesus mentions Gentiles, they're going to kill him. Well, when Paul makes his defense, all is well about his background, what he has done, and as soon as he mentions Gentiles, then they also want to kill him as well. So, as this apostle who was untimely born, then a part of his qualification to be an apostle is that he has seen the risen Lord. And here's our last thought today. Oftentimes when I read this, Jesus didn't say, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting the church?" What does he say? "Why are you persecuting me?" And as far as Jesus was concerned, if you persecute the church, you're persecuting him. And I would hope those of us, out of gratitude for being Christians, express our love for him by our devotion and love for his church today.